The empire on which the sun never sets. That was the phrase used by the Spaniards in the 1500s to describe what was essentially the world's first ever truly global empire, an unprecedented feat that would be rivaled later on by the empire built by the British, who would later appropriate this phrase at the height of their colonial endeavor, stating that the sun never sets on the British Empire, saying how at one point the British controlled territory from every single continent on Earth and over a fourth of the human population. This phrase has always stuck with me, seeing how even when the sun set in London, there would always still be daylight in other areas of the British Empire, and even if the British may not have had the best intentions, their power and influence was without a doubt impressive. As a result of these few hundred years of colonizing and conquering, the English language and culture is quickly becoming dominant in global and online culture. Now, even though the British Empire spanned through many continents and many countries, about one-third of all countries in the world as a matter of fact, there were huge differences between the administration of their overseas possessions, along with the demographics of said territories. The majority of territories that were administered by the British were never fully incorporated and given representation in the empire, with there never being any large-scale settlement of Europeans or a teaching of the English language to the general public, and such was the case with most of the British colonies in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, with the native populations not being replaced and retaining their original languages and cultures. However, there were also settler colonies all over the world where massive changes did take place demographically, culturally, and linguistically, and most people would easily be able to point them out, that being Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the good old USA, with these countries today having almost no connection to the previous peoples and cultures that inhabited them 500 years ago, aside from small minorities. These countries, along with the United Kingdom and Ireland, share a unique cultural and linguistic bond when compared to any other culture, seeing how they're divided by thousands of miles between the various continents of North America, Oceania, and Europe. Yet they all speak the same language, and most of their population shares a common origin, that being descended from the nations of the British Isles, and are also some of the world's most developed and economically prosperous nations. The countries did end up splitting off, of course, mostly due to inadequate political representation, along with geographical and logistical issues, but it's still quite incredible how so many patches of British culture survive outside of the relatively small island of Great Britain. The last political legacy of the British Empire would probably be the Commonwealth of Nations, a global organization that is largely made up of former British colonies such as India, Nigeria, Canada, Australia, and almost 50 others, although technically the only requirements for membership are the recognition of the British monarch as the head of state and adoption of the English language for international communication. Obviously, the Commonwealth is a far cry from being a revival of the British Empire, especially seeing how a few member countries such as Mozambique and Rwanda were never even a part of the empire to begin with, and their influence is largely in culture only. In today's climate, even if the Yanks, Canucks, Aussies, Kiwis, and Brits might not always get along, their countries share deep historical bonds that people in the modern world might easily glance over. In George Orwell's novel 1984, it's revealed that this is exactly the case, with these Anglo nations uniting as a single country in order to fight against the other global superpowers, that being other freakishly enlarged nations of China and the Soviet Union, and a never-ending bout for worldwide supremacy. Now, it's extremely unlikely that these closely related but still highly divergent countries will be joining together anytime soon, but there have been many movements in the past and present to unite some of these countries. For instance, up until 1841, New Zealand was administered as a part of Australia, and even once the islands became a separate colony, Australian officials heavily encouraged them to join either as one or two new states, but New Zealand had many reasons to refuse such an offer. There are still movements today to unify New Zealand and Australia, with a higher proportion of Australians supporting such a proposal than New Zealanders. The same is true for Canada and the United States, with the two having some of the closest economic ties of any two nations on the planet, and in various opinion polls, around 10 to 20% of Canadians would support unification with the United States, while across the border, around 20 to 40% of Americans would support such an idea. A real-life example of two British colonies united as one would be the Dominion of Newfoundland, which was absorbed into Canada in 1949, however before then was very much administered as a separate colony with a separate regional identity. Up until recently, with the Brexit referendum, the United Kingdom did seem to be leaning towards political integration with Europe, but ever since then, the UK has become less reliant on other European countries, and it's possible they might turn to strengthen relations with their brethren across the pond, seeing how the United States is Britain's closest trading partner. Now, it's important to realize that Irish people are not English, of course, and almost all would heavily object to using the term British to describe themselves. However, up until 1916, Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with Great Britain referring to England, Scotland, and Wales, and the impact can be seen on Irish society today, with the majority of Irish speaking English as a first language, and the two are heavily linked culturally. Now that we've got some of the history of British colonization and Anglo alliances out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at this hypothetical Orwellian superstate. By including these 6 countries of Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the population would be 462 million people, with about 78% of the population living in North America, 15% living in Europe, and 7% living in Oceania, and with an area of 10,800,000 square miles, or 28 million square kilometers, it would be by far the largest country on the face of the earth, and the second largest in all of human history, after the former British Empire at its height in 1920, although keep in mind not all of the current United States was administered under the British before independence in 1776. The percentage of people that speak English in all of these countries is well over 95% for all, except for Canada, although because of the high degree of diversity and international immigration into these countries, the percentage of people that speak a language other than English as a first language as a whole for the new country would be 22%, with the largest minority languages being Spanish, mostly in the southwest United States, French, mostly in Quebec in Canada, and various other languages from Europe and Asia. These Anglophone countries are some of the most ethnically and racially diverse areas in the world, and although all have a European majority, those of pure or overwhelming English descent would only make up about 1/5 of the population, and in the United States, only around 10% of the population is of pure English ancestry. However, when expanding to those with at least some English ancestry in the new Anglo country, this percentage rises to 1/3, including about 30% of the US, 40% of Canada, and around 50% of Australia and New Zealand. By expanding this criteria even further to include those with any amount of ancestry from one of the main 4 nations of the British Isles, that being the English, Irish, Scottish, or Welsh, the proportion rises to over half as a whole, with the United States having the smallest proportion, seeing how there were a plethora of immigrants from all areas of Europe and all over the world. It's also important to note that by expanding the definition to include those with at least 1 drop of British ancestry, we could also include the British West Indies into our new country, because even though the majority of the British West Indies, which would include countries like Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, Belize, Barbados, and many more, are of Afro-Caribbean descent, almost all carry varying degrees of English or Irish blood, meaning that they have not only English culture and language, but heritage as well, although to a lesser extent than the others. This does distinguish it from the rest of the countries with predominantly British heritage, who are all majority European, and I suppose we could also include the territories of the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina, along with Norfolk Island in Oceania. However, their populations are comparatively so small they wouldn't impact any of these statistics in a measurable way. Those of European descent would be the largest racial group in our new country at around 71%, with a low of 67% in the United States to a high of 94% in Ireland, while New Zealand sits at 68%, Canada at 76%, Australia at 77%, and the UK at 85%. The largest minorities would be those of African descent at 9.4%, being split between 6.9% Black American, 1.3% Sub-Saharan African, and 1.2% Afro-Caribbean, having the highest proportion in the United States and the smallest proportion in New Zealand, followed by those of Asian descent at 6.7%, with the largest percentages in Canada and Australia, both tied at 12.6%, and they would be divided between East at 2.4%, South at 2.4%, and Southeast Asian at 1.9%. The indigenous peoples include Native Americans at 0.86%, almost all in Canada and the United States, of course, and Pacific Islanders at 0.53%, mostly Australian Aborigines in Australia, Maori in New Zealand, and the Hawaiians, Samoans, and a plethora of others in the United States. Those of mestizo ancestry would make up 4.5% of the population, almost all in the United States, while those of other multiracial ancestry would make up 2.7%, with a low of 0.9% in Ireland. And although most people might not realize this, 8.4% of New Zealand's population is mixed race, mostly European and Maori or European and Asian, which makes it the highest in the Anglo world. Religiously speaking, the country would be dominated by Christianity, with various estimates placing the active practitioners at 65 to 75%, with the most religious country being Ireland and the least religious country being New Zealand, and around 2/3 of Christians would be Protestant, while the other third would be Catholics, Orthodox, or Mormons. 18% of the population would be irreligious, which is on the rise in the Anglo world, and over 1/3 of New Zealand's population is irreligious, although only around 6% of Ireland's population identifies as such. The largest minorities would be Judaism and Islam, both around 1.5%, along with smaller numbers of Buddhists and Hindus, around 1% each. The Anglo country would have a GDP of almost 25 trillion US dollars, making it the largest in the world and over 20% of the world's economy, although it would contain only 6% of the population, with an average income of $54,000 a year, with Ireland being the most and New Zealand the least wealthy. Even though such a union or federation between these countries is incredibly unlikely, and I think it's safe to say impossible, it's undeniable that all of these countries share a remarkable bond among the countries of the world. These nations share a common British culture, heritage, and history, along with being dominated by the English language, which is widespread enough to become the planet's universal language. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the British Empire and the Anglo countries of the world today, and also tell me where you think the capital of such a country would be. London, DC, New York, and what would the name of the country be? As always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.